Too quiet.
And still I rise. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops weakened by my soulful cries. Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I walk and I laugh like I've got gold mines pumping in my backyard. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air I'll rise. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. The poet Maya Angelou so eloquently talked about rising above all. And as women, we rise, we rise, we rise. And so today, we are excited to say that we ain't misbehaving. Women are making history and fighting for equality. Women Making Noise is our art exhibit that you'll find in the student lounge. Today, ceilings waiting to be broken, women sharing discrimination stories, our keynote address. Our panel discussion this week, what glass ceiling? Psst, splat. Y'all will get that in a minute. Monologues on Thursday evening, poetry, music, short stories, and our performances of personal experiences breaking all the rules. And then on Friday, Thursday, lessons learned, navigating the leadership path in higher education, the Edie Kokenauer Memorial Lecture. We have a week of many activities, and I want to say welcome to Women's Week 2011 at the University of Utah. This week-long event highlighting the accomplishments, challenges, and strengths of women. Since the beginning of time, women have been a force to be reckoned with, and it is our intention to keep up the noise. Good afternoon. I am Jennifer Williams-Moloch, Assistant Vice President for the Office for Student Equity and Diversity. And I've had the pleasure this year of co-chairing the Women's Week's events with Miss Irene Oda from the College of Social Work, who just disappeared, so I'll have her stand when she comes back. So we want to thank Irene and the College of Social Work, Dean Mathers, for all of their work and their co-sponsorship this year. I also want to thank the committee members for your enthusiasm, ideas, and your dedication to this year's events. Thank you for your hard work and planning and your commitment to continuing to execute this week's activities. If the committee would please just wave your hands or stand up just to be acknowledged. Thank you so much for all your hard work. I also want to say thank you to our other partners and sponsors, the President's Commission on the Status of Women, the University Marketing and Communications, ASUU Presenter's Office, the Women's Resource Center, and the Hinckley Institute of Politics. And what I do want to say is, right now we have a small audience. Don't be glum, because you know what? Whoever is here, you're supposed to be here, and it's going to reach who needs to be reached. And so we're just excited that you're here. That's what's important. Don't worry about who's not here. It's our responsibility to tell them what they missed out on, right? Okay, I just want to say a couple other things, just in terms of the history of women's history. Before 1970, many of you might not know, but there was rarely the subject of any kind. Women's history was not even a serious study. There were very few scholars who talked about and wrote about women's history, and people who really identified themselves as women historians. There weren't any formal doctoral trainings or programs about women's history, but much has happened in the last 4 decades. As today, almost every college and university across this country offers women's history courses, and most major graduate programs offer doctoral programs in women and gender studies. So our country itself even began the public celebration of women's history in 1978, and in 1981, as a joint national week-long congressional resolution proclaimed National Women's History Week. But you know, as women, we were not to be limited to a week, right? And so in 1987, Congress expanded the celebration to a month, and March was declared Women's History Month. How many of you knew that March was Women's History Month? I hope almost right. So March, now you know, March is Women's History Month. It's not the only month that we celebrate women, but we do have a national proclamation that celebrates women. You're losing me, right? So I'm gonna just talk really loud. But the University of Utah is honored to continue to recognizing the legacy of women. So today I have the pleasure of introducing a young woman who herself is a woman and a force to be reckoned with. This young woman will introduce today's keynote speaker. Esther Kim is a student here at the University of Utah studying sociology and gender studies. She is a McNair Scholar, co-chair of the Queer Students of Color, the Social Justice and Awareness Committee, Social Awareness Week chair for the Asian Student Association, a member of Voices of Diversity, and secretary of the Young Asian American Professionals. She is, among other things, an activist, an ally, an attempted, is what she says, academic, and an imperfect human being who often finds herself overextended in the things she's passionate about. And so at this time, I'd like to introduce to you Esther Kim. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Is it on? No? Hello? No? Yes? Hello, is it on? Okay. Okay. Ruth O'Brien is really into dominance and power. She's made a career of upending meanings attached to identities and challenging the status quo, questioning her colleagues, students, and readers to rethink what they know about labor, disability, race, gender, and capitalism, which makes her a fitting keynote for the 2011 University of Utah Women's Week theme, Ain't Misbehavin', Women Making History and Fighting for Equality. Ruth O'Brien earned her PhD at UCLA. She is a professor and executive officer of the Political Science PhD program at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Professor O'Brien has published Workers' Paradox, The Republican Origins of the New Deal Labor Policy, 1886 to 1935, Crippled Justice, The History of Modern Disability Policy in the Workplace, Bodies in Revolt, Gender, Disability, and a Workplace Ethic of Care, Telling Stories Out of Court, Narratives About Women and Workplace Discrimination, and Voices from the Edge, Narratives About the Americans with Disabilities Act. Professor O'Brien's teaching interest includes American politics, writing politics, and a transdisciplinary course called Power, Resistance, and Identity, part of a pending subfield combining politics, culture, and law. Professor O'Brien's work, merging contemporary theory, cultural studies, and political issues reflects the complex relationships of our own multiple identities, how our experiences are directly connected to power, dominance, and the society in which we live, and the importance of counter-narratives in reclaiming empowerment. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Ruth O'Brien. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Esther, for that lovely introduction. And I want to thank University of Utah and Dean Mathers, as well as Jennifer, and of course Irene Ota. This is the second time I'm out here, and I enjoy it more and more. This time you actually brought me in on such a beautiful day, and you know, the East Coast, the one thing my mother always said is we just had little bumps, no mountains, so this is absolutely gorgeous. And I also want to thank you for having me here for Women's History Month, because this is just very exciting. I've participated more in disability things, and Women's History Month is something I've always wanted to be more a part of. So thank you. So what I wanted to do today was just talk about a little bit, my book that she mentioned last is Telling Stories Out of Court. It's about the Civil Rights Act and workplace discrimination of women and people of color, but mainly issues around women. And so what I thought I would like to do is it's really about sharing stories, is share a little bit of my journey most recently, and then combine that with looking at the history of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and how it's been interpreted, and then how it is that I came up with this methodology of writing and sharing stories, which is about using fiction in a way that resonates differently than fact does, and so it stays in our memories. This has been very important to me. So I myself have gone on my own journey in the sense that I began teaching in the City University of New York and teaching immigrants mainly, but also different urban populations, and it's been just a wonderful experience. And I began teaching at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and I started teaching these undergraduates, and they taught me a lot. It wasn't me teaching them, it was them also teaching me. It was a very different experience. And my students taught me that we have different lives, and it's not just that we have different lives, as well as we have difference in our lives. So I wanted to go over those two things first, is about how we have different lives in combination with the difference in our lives. So let me do this in reverse order. First, difference in our lives. You know, we've now gone past the age where women actually have to behave like men, and thank heavens, because I was never very much of a gifted tomboy, and certainly not in the workplace. But secondly, I have to say we live different lives. And here I've been noticing that we have individual factors to our personality, so it adds a conglomeration of different things, like class and race, and also the personality of our parents and the situation of our parents. So what I discovered is that we have all different perspectives, even if it is about certain perspectives about gender and race. And in saying that we have these different perspectives, I noticed that there are also different class experiences, and so we really experience some similarities in terms of gender discrimination also differently. So my first experience at John Jay College was that my mother always taught me that we're supposed to have great curiosity. So this is why I feel that there's always got to be an exchange between you and the audience, between you and the people that you teach, because people can always teach us different things. So one of my first students at John Jay College, she had told me that she'd first started out at Rutgers and then she'd come to John Jay College, and so we got into this huge skirmish. I had a computer that I wanted to give away, and she gratefully accepted the computer, so we had this struggle over who was going to pick up or who was going to deliver the computer. So on one hand, I did not want her to see that I lived in the suburbs because she was living in a different part of Brooklyn, and I realized that, so we had this struggle. Should I bring it out to her or should she come out to my place? And I was so worried that she would see what a different lifespan it is, a different lifestyle it is out in the suburbs, but then meanwhile she was so concerned that I would come out to her place and see how she lived. So we had the struggle. Naturally, I had more power, so I won. And I delivered the computer to her place in a part of Brooklyn, and I noticed that here was this student. She was a straight A student. She was absolutely brilliant, and she had a child, and she and her son lived in, it was an experience. She was American, I was American, but we were such different foreign worlds that seeing this experience, it just humbled me, and I realized how I was teaching people that could teach me. So for me always, and this was I was so afraid and ashamed, but she was afraid and ashamed, and we came at it at two different perspectives. So somehow this had a profound experience on me, and I decided I had to figure out kind of where everybody lived, so I needed to unpack my different biases and my own guilt in terms of this, because we all have our different prejudices, stereotypes that lead to discrimination. My own experience is that I grew up in a household without men, and I grew up only with sisters, and so when I was in college, I congratulated my mother on the fact that I was not going to marry somebody, or I didn't have boyfriends that were not so, that I found, my friends would always say to me, how is it that I get men to respect me? From my perspective, it was that my mother, we didn't have this role model, so I was doing the turnaround, and I told my mother, thank goodness I didn't have a male role model, so then I would have the repression example that I would have to overcome, like so many of my college friends. My mother, of course, was horrified because she was not proud of having had this kind of situation, but she thought it was a very interesting turnaround. So that's what I've done most of my career, is I like to turn things around, turn the positive into a negative, and realize that sometimes the negative is a positive. And so this is where I've really emphasized the whole issue of difference can be stimulating and synergetic and creative and productive, though we can never lose the fact that, of course, there's always this aspect of repression. Then at the same time, I realized, in having been in a family of all women, that it was very nice to be a mother of boys. Because as a mother of boys, I couldn't get into this trap of saying, well, it's necessarily that men are repressive, or that we have to teach the men to be less repressive, but I have to understand that boys can also be good men, and men can teach women things, and so we have to again have this element that I call the turnaround. That at the same time, having grown up with a mother and having been so close to her, I had my next experience really is that I realized that I had an undifferentiated self. And so this meant that I was a woman that shared too much with too many people. Maybe I'm even sharing too much now with you. And sharing too much, in the end, it makes you vulnerable, and as you become vulnerable, then of course, if you're vulnerable, you can be, put in a more precarious position in which a patriarchal society can make you more powerless. So I realized, though, if you're vulnerable and you share a lot, at the same time, if you have some undifferentiated self and you're able to overcome these things and have a certain element of fearlessness, which I've always had, then you can have a certain kind of advantage over the male ego and the pride and the aloneness that comes with that. So I began thinking that if anyone is indomitable, if you combine vulnerability with fearlessness, it gives you a different kind of an edge, because there's a certain kind of element in generalizing about men in which you no longer have that element of pride that segregates them and makes them alone. So you can actually have an advantage in that sense. All of this is to say, I'm getting to the point, is that I would like to talk about how we can, in acquiring power, break through the ceiling. I don't think we just have to look at the powerlessness that we have, but also how we can acquire power, how we have had acquired power, and how we can share with each other and inspire each other. One of the things I realized too in sharing so much with so many people is that I have something that is a female trait to a large extent. I've always had a lot of mentors, and a lot of mentors have meant largely other women. And then at the same time, in not having this quote-unquote male ego, I've always been able to ask for help when I needed help. And then at the same time, there are basic issues of how women share, and as we share, we're bonding. So, and that we could do things not like a man, women get to be different, and in our differences, we also get to teach men. But now that I've lived long enough, I realize too that this is only my experience, and we have to talk about all other experiences. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, frame the talk around how we have, first, what are women's strengths and what are men's strengths, and generally speaking, not essentially speaking, how we can profit from this and how this mirrors the progression that we have in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. To me, it's all about difference, balance, perspective, and a puzzle like you can have in terms of problem solving. Like most women, I have been a victim at different times, but in refusing the mantle of victimhood and reaching out at the same time, I feel stronger. I feel stronger in my bonds to other women. I feel stronger, though, also in helping my sons. I feel stronger in helping other men. So what are women's strengths and what are men's? One of my absolute favorite statistics about civil rights, and especially workplace discrimination, is that it doesn't take 50% to mitigate and offset bias and discrimination. Generally speaking, there was one study that I heard actually third hand, I've never been able to find it, but my own experience bears this out, is that you only need 20% to change the tokenism in the room, and then it totally changes the dialogue or the discussion. And as it changes the discussion, moving things off the table, you no longer encounter then overt discrimination. Second, I wanted to look at our strength as our weakness and how our weakness is our strength. So again, my theme is always half empty, half full, and I can't help it but choose that we have to look at how it is full. So let me parallel this legal structure strength, this idea of half empty, half full parallel, and look at my personal preferences also in terms of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VII, as you probably know, is the chapter, and it's a chapter about protecting us from workplace discrimination, women and people of color. But really what has happened, the weakness of this legislation has been that while overt discrimination is now outlawed, and overt discrimination is somewhat prevented, I won't say totally, but there's somewhat prevention, it has made covert discrimination, or made discrimination go undercover. And as discrimination goes undercover, it becomes infinitely cultural, more insidious, and then of course more difficult to eradicate. That's the weakness of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the amendments after it. Second, though, we have the strength of Title VII protection. And here again, and this is why I brought in my personal life, the strength of it is there is a solidarity of women. The strength of it is that as it goes underground, this is because it's premised upon intentionality. So what we state we want to do. As it goes underground, and this intentionality, we have built up different chains of solidarity. So now we have an informal sisterhood, you could say. It's kind of like an underground railroad, if we can even make that, in which which women must bond together, and when women bond together with people of color and bond together, they are able to create this kind of a solidarity. And this solidarity is the second stage, I believe, of civil rights that we have to really propagate. So it's the idea that as individuals, even though it's individual right protection, you can create a collectivity, and that collectivity can help others. But before I get to this, let me just get to kind of the facts. And there is actually, and I named the talk after the glass ceiling, as we all know, there's actually a federal glass ceiling commission, if you can believe it or not. And whenever you make a commission in political science, it pretty much says you're no longer going to tackle the issue. And in this commission, but anyway, it gives us the facts at least. But in this commission, we now know, when I was growing up, it was 59 cents on the dollar. We have achieved some. It's now 72 to 73% on the dollar that women are able to make, black women only make it 62% of the dollar. It varies, though, by area, in which I once heard that in Manhattan, women make 87% on the dollar. But in other areas, I'm sure they make a lot less. So what we do know, though, is that American women work. And poor and working class American women have always worked. By the end of the 1970s, it was middle class women who began entering the workforce in large numbers. If their children are under the age of 6, today 72% of all women work who are raising children under the ages of 18. If the children are under 6, this number drops to 65%, and if they're infants, the number falls more to 57% of women working. But all these figures have shown how, and since the 1970s, society has shifted. Some adjustments were easy, though some have been bittersweet. The primary reason the per capita median income household income has not dropped, and that there has not been more discontent about the American economy since the 1970s, most economists now argue, is because women work. Pay inequity persists, with women making this 72 to 77 cents on the dollar, but the educational gap between the sexes does not. The gap has dramatically all but closed. Women now constitute 60% of all college undergraduates, including being 50% of the undergraduate science majors and more than 1/3 of all the engineering majors. Ironically, as former president of Harvard, Larry Summers, argued that the intrinsic aptitude helped account for the scarcity of women in the highest ranks of science and engineering, along with other factors, Wall Street clearly showed that women have caught up in education. But promotions still elude many women given the persistence of the glass ceiling, so the highest edge in terms of promotions. Only 17% of women in law firms become partners, though they have been receiving law degrees for about the same rate as men for more than 20 years. And even more hugely, we have women burdened with what sociologist Arlie Hochschild once called the second shift. I think everybody here who has any type of a family or comes from a family where the mother worked understands what the second shift is. You go home from the first shift, and of course you have the second shift of labor. In the 1990s, though, so women still do the majority of their family's family care, child care, and household duties. Family life has imposed enormous costs on women, including lowering incomes and higher costs of poverty than men or women without children face. Even more distressing is that there's a sex discrimination, or as distressing is the mommy tax, as author Ann Crittenden calls it, which exposes women to higher risks of poverty in old age or in the event of divorce. The safety net in the United States, which has never been very secure, is even less secure for women and people of color. But sex discrimination and the mommy tax are one and the same. Some of the women who cannot afford to pay this tax do drop out, given how little flexibility there is in the workplace. Rather than making a personal or individual choice, a battle between the husband and wife ensues, or a contest between the mother and child, and the state really does need to step up. If you compare this to the European nation states, they give families more child care services than they do anywhere else in the world. On the other hand, women there don't have a lower threshold of a ceiling, you might say. For instance, Italian women, 72% stay home. Dutch women, they transformed over the 1980s, but most women work now in Europe, but they're working and they have a more paternalistic state, and that paternalistic state provides more for them if they are actually in poverty. They're raised out of poverty. On the other hand, women don't have the luxury they have or the freedom they have here to work at higher rates. So we really need to do an element here of the divide and conquer factor is also very troublesome. And the divide and conquer factor comes in when we look at race and gender. And we really need to look at intersectionality, because women are often susceptible to guilt, especially white women. Because in the 1980s, most racial progress in the EEOC stalled, with white women profiting most from all of the laws. But then when you look at this, white women profiting most, of course they were profiting most because you have correlations between poverty and education that also correlate with race. So rather than making white women feel guilty for this, all the women needed to join together in realizing that it is a patriarchal society. So you have to look at the cross-cutting notions of discrimination. It's not for nothing that the upper white middle class profited most. The other women, they're discriminatory correlatives, you might say. First, if they're lacking in education and there is poverty, then of course middle class people are going to profit more, and then happen to be a racial oppression along with gender oppression, but you don't need to have a contest. So, and looking at the Civil Rights Act, I'm sure most of you have taken civil rights classes, that you understand that women were trying, that Judge Howard K. Smith in 1964 decided that he thought he'd be able to defeat this legislation that was there just to help in terms of race by bringing women into the picture. And so this is why we have Title VII that also applies to women, because he thought that the men would veto or vote the bill down if it was in any way related to women. So he thought that discrimination against women would trump, or civil rights for women would trump race, but it backfired. Now let me just look real quickly at how Title VII has changed. In 1991, we were able to have amendments made to Title VII, and these, because what has happened is civil rights is actually a law that prohibits things, it doesn't enable things. So in this sense, it's all based upon negative rights. And negative rights, as you probably know, are less substantive. They don't give us something to do, it's just something has to be prevented. But in 1991, the law changed in that we started giving punitive rights, and more costs were given, or more, not punitive, but the punitive rights were given, and then everything expanded. And the civil rights, we now have employment for civil rights as 1 in 11 cases are on the federal court dockets. One of the caveats that we have to know, and then there was the Lilly Ledbetter case, and the Supreme Court, for the first time ever, decided that it would undo the EEOC's power in saying that you had to discover when you were discriminated against for your paycheck. And so you discovered, so Lilly Ledbetter retired from the tire company, what was a Goodrich Rubber Company, and a 5-person majority overturned. They said that when she did not know what the discrimination was, that she was receiving substantially less than her paycheck, the moment it began, she couldn't protest because she had only 180 days to file for that discrimination. In the American private workplace, you don't get to know the salary of your fellow employees. So therefore, she didn't know until she retired. And of course, it totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars that she had lost. But the Supreme Court decided, aha, we've got a nice technicality. You only have 180 days to report this. So they said that it was no longer pay discrimination, or she hadn't filed for it in time. This was actually very good for civil rights in the sense that now you had a boogeyman, because the Supreme Court had really overreached with this. And so the first thing that Congress did when Obama took office is he signed the Lilly Ledbetter Act in her name, and he overturned this, so you no longer have the 180-day rule, and so civil rights in terms of pay discrimination on that level is much stronger. The second caveat that we have, so that's really changed discrimination in the sense that when the Supreme Court overreaches, Congress sometimes reacts, and in this sense it overreached so far that it reacted in a dramatic way. The second caveat that we have, and it's more on a state-by-state level and a city-by-city level, and since I work in a university, I see it more, is that we now have something called workplace violence policies. And so I'm very curious if the audience has anything to say in terms of their experience. Workplace violence is very peculiar because what it does is it takes the concept of sexual harassment and the idea that you can't have hostility or violence in the workplace, and it applies it to all employees. So what we're doing over time is we're having different civil rights pieces of legislation that first you had civil rights legislation for people of color and for women, then you had age discrimination, then you had disability discrimination, and now we're having workplace violence discrimination. If we have workplace violence discrimination, which really means that you can't have certain levels of unfairness, it's not actually about violence in the workplace, it's more about fairness and unfairness. Then the question is, do we have so many different rights that absolutely everybody is protected? And then the question is, how are we applying this? So how are we eroding capitalism in a certain sense that you can treat employees any way you want? And how are we starting to use the civil rights model to apply it to all issues? If we start to do this, will this be a more equitable workplace, or will it be a less equitable workplace? I have to say, I think that I do believe that high tides lift all boats, and if everybody starts to believe in a certain workplace based upon fairness, we have to start looking at the culture. And if we have to start looking at the culture, we have to decide how these laws are going to be applied. So this is why I turned to the issue really of the idea of fiction and how it is that we have to start looking, how we have to start sharing our stories. And in sharing our stories, we can start to change culture in this way and start to create more as a collective. There are two other rays of hope I wanted to mention in terms of the federal courts. The first is that the Supreme Court in 2006 and just recently, just a couple months ago, decided that employment discrimination, one of the biggest factors of it is not in the initial discrimination, it's actually in the retaliation that happens after the initial discrimination. So even though we have a very conservative Supreme Court at this moment, they have decided that retaliation will not be tolerated. Judges, I think, believe that retaliation is also an aspect of there is a law, the law has been violated, and as the law has been violated and someone holds suit in terms of the violation, and then there is retaliation after that, I think to some extent it's the judges saying they are being disrespected because the law is, there's a ricochet effect in terms of retaliation. Because oftentimes it is the retaliation that is the biggest part of civil rights. So this is a glimmer of hope. But the second biggest glimmer of hope, I think, is the notion, again, of solidarity that I've been mentioning, and the idea that you can have women seeking their individual rights and bond together and create a collective and create a certain kind of solidarity. And this is in a suit against Walmart. And it's coming up before the Supreme Court March 29th. And this is in which we can have women all over the country have formed. Walmart is the largest employer in the United States. And women have formed a class, and they're suing the company for discriminatory practices and allowing pretty much it's that they're not promoted to managers. The employment practices, if women join together, as each individual joins in this class action suit across the country, the goal is not that each woman would get a great settlement. The goal is not each woman will be vindicated. The goal is that women can now join together as a class, and as a class, they will have so much clout with so many large number of employees that the employers, like Walmart and other large national corporations, will realize that there's a threat of just the lawsuit, which can last 5 to 10 years, will be so expensive that they have to start changing their practices. So if they succeed, and we'll know in June, whether or not women can form a class and sue a company from an individual perspective that has collective capacity, it will change the nature of civil rights. I wouldn't venture a guess, or I'm not sure really how it's going to come down. They've won at every single level, and I met the lead lawyer who was working on the suit, and I asked her, am I right? Is this individual law now going to have collective capacity, just as there's been so little unionization in the United States? And she said yes, it would, if they were able to succeed in terms of a class. And the lawsuit, I think, has been going on for 10 years, and we will soon know. But if those two elements are great rays of hope, I think, for civil rights, because the main problem with lawsuits is, of course, you have an individual that has to bear the burden of suing. A lawsuit has lots and lots of costs. It's not just the cost of the lawyer, it's not just the cost of whether or not you will succeed or fail with a lawsuit, it's also the emotional toll and the psychological toll it takes on the individual. So obviously, in the idea of ain't we misbehaving, we'd prefer it if the employers would behave at the workplace. We'd prefer it if there wasn't this overt discrimination, which still exists, as we see with the pay equity, but even more so if there weren't cultural aspects of discrimination. And by cultural aspects of discrimination, I mean discrimination that's not labeled man against woman or one race against another race, but actually discrimination in which the ideas, the norms that the men bring into the workplace are then laid upon the women, and it's just considered normal to behave in this very specific way that we can see is a gendered way. Now let me turn to the methodology that I chose. In this book, Telling Stories Out of Court, I was trying to reach readers on both an intellectual and an emotional level, helping them think, feel, and share the experiences of women who have faced sexism and discrimination at work. It focuses on how the federal courts interpreted Title VII, the 7th chapter of the Civil Rights Act, as I've mentioned, and it uses fiction. I thought fiction would not be pedantic as the way a law text is. These stories then can help us concentrate on the emotional content of the experiences with less of an emphasis on the particulars of the law. But this is not to say that fiction is free-floating. Grouped into thematic clusters, the narratives that I used are combined with an interpretive commentary and legal analysis that then anchors the book. It is the commentary and legal analysis that reveals the impact this revolutionary law had on women in the workplace. But before I get to that and go a little bit more over the methodology, I wanted to look at the different aspects of discrimination that we now have, because I see 5 layers of discrimination that exist, and these layers are very difficult for any type of a law to eradicate. The first is prejudice, the second I'll go over is cognitive bias, the third is statistical discrimination, the fourth is social closure, and the fifth then is scripting. All of these forms of discrimination, however, the first being the one that the law most obviously prohibits, can be operating simultaneously, not singly, but they can all be operating simultaneously. The last of my favorite is scripting, and I'll spend a little bit of time on that. So prejudice, we all know, includes stereotyping, and it describes all the members of a group that are likely when individuals are not well known to the decision makers. They're the people in power. It's kind of the notion of ignorance, and they're people in Plato's dark cave. If we enlighten them, they will be able to come out, they'll be able to fill in the blanks, and of course, they will no longer be prejudiced. This is, the form that really the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is based upon. But then we have cognitive biases. See, a lot of scientists, and especially neuroscientists, have been doing more work on our visceral reactions to different types of people and how we are unaware of how we stereotype their effects and their perceptions and behavior of the people that are out. So people do not even believe that they are prejudiced, but they are as prejudiced, as they say, as people that actually admit that they are prejudiced. So it's kind of like you make what are called attribution errors, meaning you tend to focus on the success of what's called an in-group members, attributing them to skill or talent, and then the out-group, you ignore or downplay their merits and kind of emphasize their mistakes. And you do this because there's a certain amount of, you think the mistakes are evidence of a lack of skill or a potential, when actually the success is overlooked, and you treat that success as situational. We do this because we feel uncomfortable with these different types of people that we describe them as other. So we assume their aggressive tendencies are in the absence of the observation of aggression is the application of a stereotype. So this precognition, or this notion of, it's what is called as homosocial reproduction. We like to produce ourselves. We like to produce our own. It's largely automatic, and it's emotional in character. There was a series of ads that were done on women politicians, and so the visceral reaction of people, and they tie them up to the neurons, is that they see that's just, there's a certain level of repulsion that doesn't say that they're against them, but they react that way, and they don't even quite understand their level of homosocial reproduction and how it is that they're like this. Then we have the next form of discrimination is really statistical discrimination, and this is what the law has not allowed. And that's just the idea that we can count, we can see, we can observe. Why does it matter whether or not the person intended to discriminate or not? The result is the same. And so why don't we just solve that notion of discrimination by changing things? Why do we need to know why it was that the person discriminated against them? Then the fourth element, and this is much more difficult, and this is where you get to the cultural aspect, is called social closure. Discrimination is not just about the individual psychology or even a misguided notion about a profit motive in the workplace that are all negatives. These we could see as negatives, we could see as prejudice, we could see as ignorance, and we can even see the visceral reaction is conditioned by our parents. But here you have social closure is the idea that people have identities, and these identities are tied to group memberships, and these memberships and these identities influence how we interact with members of our own group and of others. It's kind of the notion of the in-group or the out-group, and it's the in-group bias, and network-based referrals are a form of discrimination as well. It doesn't have to be on the basis of gender, it doesn't have to be on the basis of race, it's just this idea that you like and know certain people and you don't like and know other people, and it's a notion then of networking. So it's the notion too of the club. But these things are not all negatives, sometimes they're actually positives. Not in the sense that they are good, I'm not saying that, but instead in the sense that we discriminate and we justify that discrimination because, for instance, you might hire someone's son or someone's daughter because they happen to be a friend. So this type of social closure discrimination, it has two things that are important about it. It's, first of all, it's protecting opportunities for the dominant group, and secondly, it preserves the status distinctions between the in-group and the out-group, and you differentiate along different lines than just race and gender. Social closure then shows you that you have to provide for context. We have to see where people are going, whereas cognitive bias or prejudice often aren't based upon this notion of context. The fifth form of discrimination, though, that I've been studying that I think is very interesting is called scripting. And so this is a different kind of discrimination that's not based upon intent. In that sense, it's free-floating. You consciously advocate the creation of beneficial evidence on an ongoing basis and envisions a potential use of that proof. So this form of discrimination was cited first by Judith Butler, who credits Catherine McKinnon. It's the idea that you orchestrate or you frame an act. It's all about performative power. In other words, it's something like encoding. So it's not that we say that this is a man and this is a woman, but instead we have the will of masculine authority is what we're based upon. And we find that that's more compelling. So it's the compliance with the command, but the command is undercover, it's under the culture, and it's just that the male issue becomes the normate, you might say. But what's so interesting about this is that it's without scripting is the idea that you can, you have to have flexibility and that you have to have a template. So for instance, when you get the phone call, when you're on the phone to the AT&T or some company and you're going to have to wait a long time, it says for, what is it, for consumer purposes or for your protection, we're going to tape the call. So of course you assume that this is for your protection if you're somewhat gullible, or you presume that, but actually what it is for is this is what scripting is all about. They collect the evidence in every single phone call, and then they can take a look and review the evidence when they want to get rid of that employee. So it's the idea that you have what is called flexible proceduralism. I mean, that's an oxymoron if there ever was one, or you proceduralize flexibility. So let me explain that a little bit. It's kind of like the template notion. You have a template in which you fill in the blanks, and then your computer learns your address and all your personal information, so it fills in the blanks. But then you realize that when you send that template off, that last 10% is your creativity. The last 10% is what you call your flexibility. But really what it is it's all decided, it's all scripted in advance. And so when you have an overwhelming amount of evidence at the workplace in which if you want to get rid of somebody because you've set them up in advance, you've set them up by scripting. So you've set them up by saying that this is the cultural, this is the normate, this is how we do things, and we can't have any discrimination against women or people of color. And so there's this overwhelming amount of evidence. So if you want to get rid of them for whatever reason, you're able to do that because it's kind of, another way to describe it is it's open-ended lawyering. And so it's that, so it really is that phone call conception. But if people are able to have that kind of overwhelming amount of evidence that they could fire people for whatever reason, because in most states we have employment at will, which is that any person could be fired for anything except for discrimination, then they start to use discrimination law to fire people at will in a different way. So it's not something that in any way then allows for the flexibility of the employer or the employee. So let me give you another example. So it's that there's a dynamic. It's that everybody, another place to look at scripting, as everybody knows, is the 50th year anniversary of Harper Lee's book, The Mockingbird. She uses fiction, and she's trying to expose the anatomy of segregation at the moment when they were just starting to legally dismantle it. Like William Du Bois' work, it's really about the mechanization of discrimination. It's about the structural situation in which you can use discrimination laws for or against men and for or against women and also people of color. You use fiction to facilitate kind of a cultural change in the face of law's failure to end that discrimination and to show the injustices that are visited upon black citizens of southern towns. So she uses it to form what you would call the theoretical framework that Kimberly Crenshaw later comes up with of intersectionality. Race doesn't occur independently of the histories of gender or sexuality. It's used to influence and shape everything. So this is the theory of intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw, in which she argues that it's not just separate, it's actually cross-cutting, and that there are layerings of gender plus race. So it's really the notion that you have mutually constitutive ways of using race and gender in these different ways. So it's almost like living a double life. And living a double agent life, the cross-cutting forces, and that these norms go underground, and we assume that they're encoded with male attributes, it makes it much more difficult to prove discrimination. Cultural aspects of discrimination then become almost like the air we breathe, and it's very difficult to establish intent, and since the law is all based upon the intent, it's very difficult to prove discrimination. So another way to look at this notion of scripting is a production line approach. It's routinizing the customer interactions, you might say. It's substituting technology, and you come up with patterns of interaction for skill and motivation. So it's a way, for instance, another way to look at it is Employee of the Month. The Employee of the Month is the idea that you get the employees to behave in a better way, but at the same time you're not going to pay them management salaries, so they start self-regulating themselves. As they start self-regulating themselves, it's a different type of production line. Another place to look at it is in Famous Amos. They used to have this idea that they had collected so much data on each employee that they actually knew how much the average person would cheat, and eat 3 cookies or whatever a day. So they would put that into the production line and know, well, oops, there are 5 cookies, so now we're into a level of corruption, so therefore that person has to be let go. So it's this idea that you can collect so much information on your employees. There's absolutely no sense of privacy, that you can look at civil rights in this way too, and you can see that you're scripting certain aspects that, if they're not properly designed, are going to inculcate discrimination as opposed to eradicate those different levels of discrimination. So it's that discrimination is, it's really a routinization that you start to encode these laws that really are disempowering to women. Now let's turn to kind of why it was that I wanted to look at fiction. So to me, my hope was that my generation, I came out in the 1980s out of college, and then the 1990s in terms of my graduate education. I was not very appreciative of the women that came up before me. I did not quite realize how difficult it was that they had it, and how much they had broken through a few ceilings for me. And so when I started to look at the issue and realize how much I had benefited from it, I started to convey this idea that, that what was going on? Why was I facing the same kind kind of glass ceiling that they were facing. And then I started to look back in the 1960s and realized that they had done so much, the National Organization for Women, that I didn't appreciate. So I started to feel very ungrateful because I didn't start out my career. I started out looking at labor, looking at capitalism, looking then at disability, but it's only last that I really came to gender. So I realized that I needed to do something more, you know, as kind of a tribute to all the women mentors that I had that had shared their experiences with me, and I had been so ungrateful. So that's when I started looking at fiction and how it is that we can look at how fiction resonates. And because I see such a cultural aspect of discrimination, we have to see the ambiguity of discrimination. But this notion of ambiguity is so complex, it's so difficult to prove at so many different times that we don't just want to look at motives, and we just want to look at how it is that people interact, and we can share our stories with each other. So initially, there is a lot of drama around civil rights in the United States, especially in terms of real stories. You had Charlize Theron in her Oscar-winning performance as a Minnesota miner and looking at the first sexual harassment suit in this film, North Country. And these are real stories, though, that are bound by history. And so there's lots of that nonfiction, and I thought it had kind of an American boost to it because it's always, you know, the victor conquers all in the end, but it didn't have the complexity that I saw that you might want to have. So I decided that storytellers often, you can't focus on the facts because the facts are not necessarily the essence of the story. The essence of the story really is more about the ambiguities. So I decided not to do nonfiction, but only to rely on fiction, because then the fiction didn't have to be constrained by the facts, and it concentrated really on the everyday essence of discrimination. So telling stories out of court gives readers the opportunity to think about discrimination and really to think about and ponder how it feels to face it. Philosophy and literature have long observed that having narratives creates a meaning of examining philosophical issues. An author can create characters that embody philosophical ideals, and when the readers imagine these characters, they explore these very same ideals, albeit with a different subjective lens. Some narratives can go as far as to raise what I call thought experiments. That is, readers explore the characters' motives and observe their actions, and then watch how it all unfolds. Thought experiments are kind of like a what-if scenario or a hypothetical. But unlike a legal hypothetical, the narratives in this book explore more of a thought experiment based on what happens as a result of discriminating behavior. What compels somebody to practice discriminatory behavior? Is it ignorance or is it fear? Perhaps the behavior is motivated by the employer's desire to maintain power or a colleague's quest for power. Is discrimination induced by society, or is it nature, or is it a bit of both? Is it part really of the human condition? The hypotheticals in this book were really about how does it feel experiments. How would it feel to be discriminated against in the circumstances of the story? That's what it's about. How would it limit someone's potential? Would this type of adversity make the person stronger or weaker? Does someone's discriminating behavior provoke a protagonist's anger, or does it actually weaken them and they just fall apart? Should it provoke anger to get people more motivated or not? Does it deflate or dampen or limit the energy of the protagonist or their energy or skill, or could they just put the energy and skill they could actually have put into their job? Can discrimination be so subtle that readers wonder if a character understands how debilitating it actually is? And also, can a protagonist help engender her own discrimination? Can you participate in your own exploitation? Those are the subtleties that we don't get in law. In literature and aesthetics, they look often at how experiments look at thought and an ethical society. So fiction really captures ideals that are vivid and images that are vivid and that really give us a complexity that you can't get in straightforward law. But then what I did is I have a series of fictional stories, and then I analyze these fictional stories according to the law, but I disconnect the law from the fiction. It's very important to disconnect the law from the fiction because it permits the scholar who's analyzing the laws then to understand the legal questions in a more systematic way. The commentary for these gives you a chance to explore how the stories mirror typical sexual discrimination cases as a means of supplementing the what happens and how do we feel hypothetical terrain. It follows in each story, I put them into a cluster so I could pull out the main legal themes of the law. So from the stories, and it weaves together the threads, so I'm really looking at the stories and then analyzing how it is that the federal courts have reinterpreted and interpreted Title VII over time. There are 4 different pieces of commentary that I linked all the stories in. And the first was we look at gender roles. Secondly, we look at sexual harassment lawsuits. Thirdly, I looked at equal treatment and intentional discrimination. And fourthly, I looked at substantive equality. First, you had gender roles. So the very first basis of any ordinance of law is we have to understand how it is that we are in our specific roles. So the first story is looked at home, in politics, or in business. Women first have to deal with powerful stereotypes that they have to put them in their proper place. So one of the stories by Sharon Orrin Wardner called Dream Man, she's the quintessential wife and mother, and she has to analyze how it is when her husband walks in on her son having relations with his girlfriend. How do they unfold this entire situation? It shows you the different gender roles that you have to play. Then I have another story by Esther Jackson, and this is where you had one African American who's a successful bank manager, and she's wondering if this other African American who is coming from a work project program, does she have the right culture to be able to be that kind of employee? So there you have cross-cutting issues of race and culture and class, as well as gender, all talking about the different levels of discrimination. Secondly, the book looks at unfair treatment and intentional discrimination, which is a pivotal part of the Civil Rights Act, and it looks at unfair treatment in the workplace. Is there such a thing as unlawful discrimination? This is the biggest issue for any court case, is does it rise to the level of discrimination? Does it fall below that level? It's not about justice, it's not about being right, it's actually about whether or not the law fits the story. Then I looked at sexual harassment, and sexual harassment is it's a law that's actually not about women against men, it's actually about harassment and sexual harassment in the workplace. So for instance, one of the perversities of this law is that if an employer treats all employees hostilely, not just, and talks about sexuality in a certain way, not just women, then actually there's no sexual discrimination. So if he belittles a man as much as he belittles a woman in terms of sexual harassment, there would be no harassment in terms of the law. So there I look at some stories, or we bring in some stories about women that face difficult legal standards for proving sexual harassment. And then finally I look at the question of substantive equality for women. What sort of fundamental workplace and social changes are needed to achieve genuine gender equality? Because we're a country based upon negative rights, this means that we don't really believe in substantive equal treatment for women, substantive equal treatment for most people. So why is it that women or people of color would get substantive equality? This has been the most difficult thing to prove, and it's a question of a spotlight on what is normal, what is a normal workplace. If you normally deprive everybody of fair treatment, why should women get fair treatment? Why should people of color get fair treatment? This is where these questions become very difficult to fight. In the end, though, I think it's all about balancing, and these stories really reveal our emotions. At the same time, as I analyze the law according to commentary, you can see the argument. So on one hand, you have emotions, on the other hand, you have argument. And if you look at how we have to put the two together, you could, because there is a certain kind of theory, there was a very big set of cases or books that you probably heard of, the critical race theory of Derek Bell and Patricia Williams. And they took their own life experiences, Patricia Williams did, and she put it into showing us how we can understand how it feels to be discriminated against. But then she interwove the notion of the law in the same stories, and so this was attacked. They were best-selling books, and they had a great impact, and they're really fantastic. But at the same time, it was denigrated because it wasn't legal analysis. So in these series of books that I'm trying to do, I separate the two because it's more about fiction, and you don't have to attach to the law, but you can criticize the legal element and then build on that legal element. So this way you had really emotions on one side and you had argument on the other side. And we also have to look how the federal courts created and rely on legal precedents, and that these don't always capture discriminating behavior. Sometimes what is missing can be more debilitating than what is actually there, causing a person who faced discrimination not being able to seek relief and to drop it. But still, the solidarity I believe that these stories can build can help us face the next situation. And the absence, too, of not being able to sue is instructive in that it shows how ill-equipped Title VII is really able to handle, successful discrimination suits. So we use the fiction very liberally to explore several issues. The first is really the questions that are raised and not raised by the characters in the specific setting. The second is drawing out and illustrating specific points within the federal court's interpretation of Title VII. And the third is to ask and respond to questions like, would the women in the stories have legal claim under Title VII? If so, how would they go about to prove that sexual discrimination actually occurred? And if not, what is missing? Is there simply a lack of evidence, or does the law not remedy the real problems in everyday gender inequality? So it's really about this notion of how does it feel perspectives, and I was hoping that people would read the book and the how to feel perspectives and be able to understand that fact sometimes actually follows fiction. So there's no proper analysis of the Civil Rights Act that appears in the stories because I want this emotional aspect always to resonate. And it was really this notion, somebody took me aside, there was a conference at Ohio State about this idea of using fiction and fact from my first book I had, Voices from the Edge. And there I had the editor of a journal called Narrative sit me down, and I didn't quite understand why they were so excited about this, but he said what I was doing was I was having the fiction writers write on spec, which is that I told them, here, go write a story about women, and then I'll see how it perceives in terms of how it is that we can interpret it according to the Civil Rights Act. And he said what we were doing was actually performing politics, because we were writing about our experiences, but these experiences were fictional, and so it was like political fiction. I told him I didn't think political fiction was necessarily very good because it was too much, motivated by what was the justice, and the script then was not necessarily ambiguous, and to me the ambiguity was the most important. But what he told me was just that we captured the essence of the everyday aspect of discrimination, and then at the same time we were propagating that we wanted the reform in federal laws, or we wanted the courts to interpret the federal laws in different ways, that this was actually what he called, and I named a PhD program around it, this notion of writing politics. Because for me, finally, in the end, I think that fiction is ultimately more subversive than any form of a monograph, or something dry, even like the presentation today, and that we really have to look at how we look at the moral conflict of the day. And the stories have the ability to collectivize us, to inspire us. We're all, in terms of going back to my notion of the undifferentiated self, that I am too much about sharing, but sharing has its own power. Even though you make yourself vulnerable, at the same time as you share, you can have other people that see the power that you have, and you can be a collectivity. You can join together like the Walmart suit. So each of you are separate, but as you share, you can all join hands together and be able to create a stronger sense of what is injustice in the United States in terms of civil rights. So let me leave you just with one quote I found in writing about morality and ethics by Anne Lamott, a great fiction writer. She said, the word moral has had such bad associations with fundamentalism, stiff-necked preachers, and priggishness. We have to get past that. If your deepest beliefs drive your writing, they will not only keep your work from being contrived, but will help you discover what drives your characters. You may find some really good people beneath the packaging and the posing, people whom your readers, we like, whose company we rejoice in. So a moral position is not a message. A moral position is a passionate caring inside you. A moral position is not a slogan or wishful thinking. It doesn't come from outside or above. It begins inside the heart of a character and grows from there. Oh, thank you. So we have time for questions. Are there any questions? Or statements? Statements? She says.
I'm interested in the power dynamic aspect across lines, gender, race, just that pre-exists. That's very interesting to me. I'm wondering if you can recommend any reading that deals with the subject in general, specifically in business.
Let's see. There's a new book out by Routledge just in 2008, but and I think it has something with women in work in the title. That's a great book to begin with.
What was the the name of the author?
Now I can't remember the name of the author. Yeah, but it's Routledge. It is 2010, with women in work in the title.
Just a comment as well. I was very interested in hearing you say that you hadn't appreciated the women who had gone before. And so you realized where you got was really off the backs of those women and their struggle. And I would say the same thing, that people fail to see that it's labor unions that really have shaped the work week the way we know it, and a lot of these things that we just consider, 9 to 5. Wondered if you'd comment on that for a minute.
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, unions, this is where I see the collective capacity. Unions have, had been struggling greatly the last, since 1980, really, when it was outlawed, pretty much the right to strike. And then you have more and more employment at will states. So it's become very, very difficult. But unions, in the 1960s and 70s, I think there was a moment when, they did normalize the workplace. They made it so there were certain issues of fairness and equity that were there, but they have had a checkered past with gender, of course. But at the same time, so unions have the collective capacity, really, if you have an agreement, to put within that civil rights elements. And so that's where I see the greatest capacity, and they do that. It really just depends upon the union. But with the Walmart case, what was so exciting about that is because we've had this paradigm since unionization has dropped off since the 1980s, that then you have to go for individual rights, but individual rights are individual successes, and the individual successes don't necessarily change the workplace. We're not really out there to pursue litigation. We want change. The best way to have change is in larger groups, like when we had stronger unions. At the same time, if you can have class action suits, then employers will have to start transforming the workplace in a way that's fundamental. So in Walmart, also with Home Depot, they've had allegations. The allegation is, of course, that they promote men to management positions and not women. Or even at Home Depot, the women are not on the floor, but they're the cashiers. The cashiers are naturally paid less. And so it's systemic discrimination in that way. People don't want to sue. People just want change. So the idea is that you have to have more and more change. But if individuals can join together, they're going to have a greater capacity for change than each person pursuing their own lawsuit. Litigation is also incredibly expensive, and unfortunately, they don't do it on the basis of, how much you can win, because unlike personal injury lawsuits, there's not a lot of money in civil rights discrimination, so the person pretty much has to front a house up, $100,000 to litigate, and then the question is, do you even have that strong of a suit? The EEOC takes on each case for certain individuals, but they take on so few cases, it's really just a drop in the bucket. And some of the most egregious cases don't get taken on for different reasons. But mainly, you can't have change in the workplace if it's individual by individual. There has to be some form of a collectivity, and the class action suits are that collectivity. I do suspect, though, it's not going to work. After 12 years, I think they started 10 years ago. It's gone through every single threshold, but now the murmurings are around the court that they're saying that, can you have a class of people that's 50% of the population? So, or does a class have to be a smaller group of people? Now, the people that gathered all the information for the lawsuit, they were very careful to show across the nation, because Walmart is such a large employer, that it happened absolutely every single place, and it was systematically against women. But that's the question, is can a class of people be 50% of the population? So that's what's problematic. But we'll see by the questions, but we'll hear in June. If it does do that, and I've been told by the editor of Cornell to go out and seek more books, this really will transform both collective rights as well as individual rights for all groups of people, because of course this will not just be for women, it will be for any class of people that can join together to show systemic discrimination along cultural grounds, rather than having to show for each case that the employer intended to discriminate against you. So in other words, it's a way around that statistical issue. So it's a way around pay inequity. If you have 100% of a paycheck for men and 70% for women, they're going to have to start to explain that. We don't have to look for, did you intend to pay that little? No, of course they didn't intend to pay that little, but they systematically pay that little around the country in a class. Then they're going to have to change their behavior. Because a class action lawsuit, even though you might pay each employee only $1,000 for the discrimination, because it's a large class, it brings the employer down on their knees. So the power inequity is addressed. Because the power of an individual against a corporation is very small. That's why we had unionization in the first place. So it's a difficult way to eradicate discrimination of any type.
I just wanted to get your kind of personal take on what your thoughts are on the women's movement in terms of, you made a comment of covert sexism nowadays. So in our culture, we don't see it even as women. We don't see it unless we experience it. Curious as to what your opinion is on the women's movement and where it's going today, what its weaknesses are, and how it can elevate.
Well, I always think, I mean, since I first started out as a politics professor, that the weakness is the element of power, and how do you achieve power as individuals? So women have to, reach more out in terms of solidarity. What I see, is that you have, young women, you have this movement. I mean, you just have these class inequities that undercut it as well. So, for instance, there was a series of articles in the New York Times a number of years ago saying that women were going to Yale and Harvard and Princeton, and they were even going to business schools, but they want to get out, be highly educated, and become housewives. Well, first of all, this is the same time, I mean, this was in the late 1990s that this kind of literature started popping up. And it was written, of course, by a woman that graduated, I think, from one of those Ivy League institutions. But they're saying this at the same time that they're saying with welfare to work that women have to start working if they're to receive welfare, or the welfare to work proposition. So it's always about class. So I think the weakness of the women's movement is that they really have to reach into different issues of class and poverty, because there is a feminization of poverty that's been around for, decades upon decades. And so you have to start transforming things like looking more at family law and looking how it is that men aren't paying proper support and those different avenues. And we're going to say that we shouldn't have welfare unless the women will go back to work. Why are we also at the same time in the same culture propagating the idea that you should be highly educated and go back into the home? So we have these mixed messages that are very harmful in saying, the guilt of going to work and then the guilt of not working. So it's really these mixed messages, and a lot of these mixed messages are along the issues of class. So for me to really conquer, or to really examine notions of how capitalism propagates some of these cross-bending issues or cross-cutting issues is also as important as the race and gender, intersectionality. I think we have to look more at the issue of class. But you never have to say it's one or the other. It's race or it's gender or it's class. These things always you have correlations, and correlations really don't have to show causality. So we shouldn't get caught up in the fight of which comes first, and so we should look at things more simultaneously as free-flowing in terms of kind of rivers of discrimination. But if there's a workplace violence procedures, if this becomes, I think to some extent, the workplaces there's a potential for some change in saying, why don't we just have fairness? And then looking at what are the norms behind fairness. That's kind of where we need to go. The idea of intent is an old-fashioned, legal idea that could easily be outmoded if Congress wanted to tackle it in some way, shape, or form. But that's always been the most difficult, but we have to know the history of civil rights. It had to first go through the courts. It couldn't go to the legislature because there was so much discrimination within the popular culture. I don't think there's that element of discrimination now in the popular culture, so why don't we take it out of the courts and have more even-handed laws that have to do with results than have to do with this idea of case-by-case, intent or not intent. What was your motive behind, the person receiving less money or not as good work conditions? So this also then always gets to the issue of child care, because child care is the number one element in which women have to worry about more than men, families have to worry about. So to some extent too, if you universalize things along the levels of class, you might have some more interesting discussions that could provoke some solidarity. But it's difficult since we no longer have channels of groups of people, since unions have been decimated in the United States. Well, thank you.
This is just a small token of our gratitude and appreciation for you coming here. I've known Ruth for a couple of years. She came out for a College of Social Work venue and was amazing. She spoke to the disability issue, and many of us had meals with her and found her. She's so broad. She's got such a broad range of knowledge and expertise. So it's a privilege to have you here. Thank you.